Let's talk about the ownership of NBC, or its involvement in the news. You touch on his potential, like, stories, anecdotes of his interference. I have a couple of my own. Back in the day, in the early aughts, um, I knew people who worked there, and I would hear stories of him calling down back when Frank Luntz was on air, and him calling down and having problems with Donahue when Donahue got off the air, and that ran through. I mean, you talk about the election. How much of that was going on, and why else would you buy that if you are a GE? Why else? Why else would you own a media enterprise if not because you have ancillary interests that are associated with that?
Listen, I think there are a bunch of reasons why GE bought RCA, which was the parent company of NBC at the time of the merger in '86 or '87. It was they had a big TV set business that they wanted to merge with, and that actually became a big TV set business, fulfilling his number 1, 2, or 3 mandate. It was an advertising business, and he was keen to diversify away from manufacturing and get into things like advertising. NBC, he understood, was a potential host of the Olympics on television, and he liked that. Welch was sort of like absolutely liked the limelight and bid on the Olympics in part to entertain his friends and stars. And yes, in time, I think he realized that he had the potential to influence coverage. Now, I cite a few examples of that. I've heard of a couple others. I don't get the sense that he was quite meddling in coverage on a daily basis, or necessarily that the opinion arms of NBC reflected his political priorities in quite the way that for example, the Wall Street Journal's op-ed page is seen to be a pretty clear reflection of Rupert Murdoch's
Right.
political priorities. But yeah, there was a moment in the election in 2000, the presidential election in 2000, where allegedly he was pressuring the decision desk to call the election for Bush well before all the votes were counted. A few years before that, when the stock market was tanking, I think it was Tom Brokaw who was giving a pretty sober report on air. And Welch calls down and says, "Tell him to stop. You're killing the stocks," right? He didn't like the fact that GE's stock was going down as a result of this coverage. So he understood the power of the media full and well.
And then there were issues with, like, what I guess you would refer to as shady practices. Surprise, surprise, but they were pretty significant.
Can you be a bit more specific? There's a
Well,
lot of
the
shady.
SEC. I mean, towards the end, the SEC was looking into was issuing fines. The DOJ was issuing fines. Like, what was going on here with these accounting practices, or?
Yeah, Welch faced multiple scandals throughout his career and survived them in a way that I think it's almost hard to imagine a CEO getting through that kind of a gauntlet today. But he survived for 20 years. There were defense scandals. There were collusion scandals in the diamond industry. More than once, GE under Welch was accused of defrauding the government knowingly. And all of these things you could see in the settlements and the depositions, sort of the hallmarks of this absolute focus on increasing profits at all costs, coming right down from the top to the people who were actually committing the crimes. Now, after he left, the scandals continued to rack up. And on the accounting side, what happened was GE Capital, which we talked about earlier, became a vehicle, an instrument that the parent company could use to essentially manipulate its earnings, to smooth out its earnings. A few days, a few weeks before each quarter would end, it would look at the number that that analysts on Wall Street were expecting it to report, and it would make deals, fire people, take charges, find profits through GE Capital, whatever it needed to do to make those numbers look just right and keep the stock on this absolutely inexorable march upward. What happens several years later? The SEC catches on. Like, there are all sorts of shady accounting practices going on, and they settle for, I think, several $billions. Now, that settlement, important to note, pertained to periods, I think, from 2003 to 2005, so just after Welch retired. But in the settlement, they note that these practices, these same sort of things, look to have been well established. And the implication was clear. Though the SEC might not have had the goods, in part because regulation was much looser then. Financial reporting standards were much more lax in the 80s and 90s, but they were saying as clear as they could, this kind of stuff has been going on for a long time at GE.
So, in the end, I mean, I mean, I know that you cite sort of like companies that are sort of changing, that are practicing business in a different way. Talk about that, but ultimately, aren't we really talking about we need to go back to a pre-Reagan version of regulation and of taxation? I mean, if you look at things like the stock buybacks, if you look about the changes in capital gains, which influence the way that people are compensated and allow for more stock compensation, that coincides with all of this ideology about shareholder value over all the other values that, a stakeholder value, if you will, in terms of companies. We mentioned stock buybacks. Antitrust completely changed in the early 80s, late 70s, in terms of the way that the government would perceive, that type of buying up and shedding of businesses, and would be, in a different regime, maybe one that we're starting to see today. Just you wouldn't get away with it. Give me your sense of that.
I don't think we can turn back the clock. I think there are some values, some priorities, some of the ways that the government tried to actually regulate companies in the economy from earlier in the 20th century that can serve as useful models. But as you said a couple of times in this conversation, the world changed and the world's going to continue to change. So I think it'd be naive to think that we can sort of snap our fingers and go back to the golden age of capitalism, as it were, and think that companies are magically going to sort of stop prioritizing shareholders and strike this more equitable balance. I think it's just not going to be that simple. Instead, what I'm looking for are changes to incentive structures, changes to systems, changes to markets. I think where we can start nudging companies, or if the government can ever get its act together, actually start regulating some of these changes and start essentially mandating or finding ways to incentivize companies to take better care of their workers, to stop doing everything at the expense of anything that might compromise shareholder value. And I point, as you say, in the book, to a few examples of companies that are starting to make steps in this right direction. But I don't think anything is going to happen quickly. And the way I think about it is, it was a generational project that I describe in this book. It was decades and decades of work, from laying the intellectual groundwork from people like Friedman and Hayek to people like Welch actually taking the advantage of it and trying to put it into place, to decades of his proteges really driving this ethos down deep into our economy, to the point that a lot of people today don't even realize that things used to be a different way. Similarly, I think it's going to be a generational project. I think it's going to take decades of work to really create a more equitable economy. I wish it could happen faster. Anything that can nudge things along in the right direction, I'm all for it. But the reality of how big these problems are, the reality of how entrenched some of these systems are, suggests to me we are looking at decades of work ahead of us.